In the 18th century, when it all began, an overwhelming majority of Europeans tended to live in the countryside. It is estimated that in Eastern Europe, about 90% of all the people lived in the countryside and were associated with their occupations like agriculture and animal husbandry. Western Europe, which was relatively more developed in terms of commercial and urban organization, it is estimated that not more than 25 to 30% of the people at any one point of time lived in the towns. In terms of the cities that actually existed, if one looks at the amenities that went with it, not many things that one normally takes for granted in urban life today used to feature in 18th century Europe. There were problems to do with health and hygiene, there were problems of sanitation, and all other sorts of medieval hangovers of a number of people living in a dingy place, heavily concentrated, heavily populous, was fairly regular. Even transport used to be fairly primitive. It used to be said that it was easier to commute between two countries rather than a country to its countryside. This entire picture changed almost entirely within the next century as the towns began to grow in size and a large cluster of urban conurbations began to develop all across Western Europe, and small towns or even villages in Britain and France began within the course of a decade or two to transform into large urban conurbations. The dramatic change that this came to signify in European life revolved primarily around the changes in industrial economy. A large number of factories and workshops began to grow, which relocated the main frame of production, industrial production, from artisanal houses, the cottages of the artisans who were actually involved in the labor that goes into the making of an industrial product, to a workshop which is invested in, where the capital is provided by a merchant and where people come to sell their labor rather than their skill. The changes that followed as a result in European society have variously been identified as either the beginning of the modern capitalist order or even as beginning of modern society. There are by and large some agreements about what exactly constitutes modern life. One of these is that the vortex of social and economic prowess, social and economic power in modern society is located in ownership of industrial capital as against ownership of agricultural wealth, which used to be the pre-modern stage of society. The second is that in a modern society, the reliance on technology and machinery which saves labor this reliance is much greater, much more considerable, and technology is generally held at a premium. Which means, of course, that two dominant features of modern society are that industry is the pivot of economic activity rather than agriculture. Subsistence is no longer the predominant objective of economic activity, rather trade, generation of capital, and investment of that capital in technological innovation, which makes life easier over a period of time. Till the 19th century, the overwhelming majority of the economic activity tended to revolve around subsistence, tended to revolve around food. In more developed economies, such as in Western Europe, commerce had certainly begun to play a major part in the series, in the clusters of activities that makes an economy. Nevertheless, as historians like Fernand Braudel have pointed out, that there was quite a heavy emphasis on agricultural commodities even when it came to commerce. In the 19th century, this shift that took place in terms of epicenter of economic activity from the agricultural to the industrial sector, this transformed human society. It transformed human society because a large number of people began to be employed in industrial production. So it has the set of changes then that begin have been variously classified into three broad heads. In the first place, once the shift takes place from agriculture to industry, once the locale shifts from a locale of production shifts from the artisan's cottage to the workshop, the relative significance of the labor that is exerted, the human element of production begins to decline. As the skill of the artisan begins to decline, he is moved from the artisanal cottage to the workshop in order to operate a machine, which becomes the second factor in conjunction with this change, with this revolutionary transformation of the product of the process of production. The growing reliance on the machinery necessarily requires a heavy input of technology, also occasionally a heavy endowment of capital resources. In fact, this was one of the major reasons why the locale of production had to be shifted from the cottage of the artisan to the workshop run by the entrepreneur who makes the investment. And the third and perhaps the most important intervention, or the most important factor in the rise of industrial societies, happens to be the shift in for the purpose of industrial production from animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy. To give an example, if a mill had to be operated, it could be operated by animal power. You could run the mill with bullocks drawing the load, or horses drawing the load. In the realm of transport, for instance, if you had to go from point A to point B, you need a horse-drawn carriage, where the energy that is required for the movement, for the displacement, as it were, was to be given by animal power. It could also, where animals are not in good supply, or where animals are not capable of performing the task, it could also be the human endeavor. These changes, the effect of these changes was to overhaul the entire economic and urban organization in Europe. The dramatic transformation that industrial production and change in industrial production brings about is seen in terms of the cities that begin to grow. A larger number of people begin to find livelihood in these new industrial centers. On the other hand, with more and more people earning livelihood, more and more people were able to generate demand for manufactured goods, for industrial goods, and that further stimulated the European economy. Now, historians have debated variously about the aspects of about the emergence of industrial revolution. I mean, to start with, was the origin actually to be located in the 18th century or even before that? If it was in the 18th century, then why was it in the 18th century? A still more important question is, when industrialization began, why did it begin in Britain? Why not anywhere else? There were other countries that were equally developed in terms of their economic character, in terms of the industrial organization, in terms of the commercial reach. France is a very good example. Why did it happen in Britain and not in France? There is another very serious argument that is raised frequently by historians of the colonial world, saying that European industrialization was made possible by the exploitation of the colonial markets. Is that the case? Was European colonial empire the determining factor in the making of the Industrial Revolution, or was it merely a contributory factor? Did it simply make it convenient? Did it simply facilitate an industrial transformation that would have happened anyway? The questions, in fact, point to a much larger question, that was the Industrial Revolution really much of a revolution, or was it somewhat of an evolution? The first time the term Industrial Revolution was actually broached was in 1837, when Auguste Blanqui was looking at the changes that were taking place in European social life. He had primarily the French in mind, and he spoke of the revolutionary transformation, the transformation as revolutionary, and he coins the term Industrial Revolution. Two renowned German exiles working in England engaged with this term a little more, Friedrich Engels and Karl Marx, looking at the manner in which European society was changing, the manner in which radicalism was fast becoming an option, and the old political order was no longer representing the aspirations of Europeans. Marx and Engels began to identify the industrial capitalist system, the industrial capitalist organization, as the pivotal factor in this transformation of European society. And they too, therefore, spoke of the revolutionary character of the industrial organization and the manner in which it changed from the second half of the 18th century in Britain and increasingly in the first half of the 19th century elsewhere in Europe. But the person who coined this term in historical discourse was Arnold Toynbee in course of a Kerr speech in the Cambridge University, when he argued that the Industrial Revolution began in Britain towards the close of the 18th century, bringing about a revolutionary change because it brought to an end the centuries-long system of guild-dominated industrial production, and where the market-centric competitive industrial economy, which would not be regulated by any guild of artisans. In the 1930s, however, another English historian, John Harold Clapham, dismissed this hypothesis of revolution, and he put forward instead the argument of an evolutionary transformation. He was drawing his argument from the research done by other continental historians of this point of time, people like Paul Manteau, who argued that the character of change has to be located not simply in Britain, it has to be located elsewhere in Europe as well. And once one looks at it, the continuities in terms of the evolution are more pronounced than the breaks that were occasioned by the revolution, the so-called revolution of the 1770s. In the decade of the 1930s and 40s, historians like J.U. Neff further strengthened the argument by showing that owing to the expansion of global commerce in the 16th and 17th centuries, the manufacturing sector of all the European societies across the board, all Western European societies across the board, had gone continual transformation. As the market horizons began to expand, more and more European industrial sectors were looking at markets overseas, and in order to capture that market, they would tend to undergo changes as and when required. J.U. Neff argues that the wars that were occasioned by the French Revolution, and even before that by European political situation, the ravages caused by the war tended to sort of disturb the normal trajectory of economic growth as countrysides were ravaged, as normal economic demand began to be disrupted. European industry began to lag behind in the 18th century. By contrast, Britain, which did not have a single war affecting its physical environment of industrial production in the 18th century, managed to make the transformation, make the leap from a pre-modern guild-dominated system to a modern industrialized system. And the main thrust of his argument lay in the fact that this evolution was taking place for over a period of 3 centuries, so he would argue it was not much of a revolution. Later, in the 1970s and 80s, historians like Peter Kreter came to endorse this argument. Kreter, in his very heavy emphasis on the significance of proto-industry, argued that between 16th and 18th century, European industrial production had tended to move away from the guild-dominated industrial production that Toynbee had spoken of when he had mentioned the Industrial Revolution. Kreter argued that because of social and economic factors that were fairly common all over Western Europe, a large number of people living in the countryside had actually switched to proto-industry, meaning industrial activity as a substitute for their agricultural activity. And this they did in order to generate more income, more sources of income in the countryside. But the bottom line is that there was a subset of skills, a reservoir of skills and industrial capability developing in the countryside over a period of more than 200 years. And Kreter argued that this relentless advance of European industry from the 16th century onwards, caused by the expanding horizons of European commerce, propelled the emergence of a manufacturing sector in the West European countryside, which almost everywhere in West Europe had the potential of transformation by bypassing the guild-dominated traditional system. This pre-industry, Kreter argued, was the bedrock on which subsequent industrialization was to take place. However, other historians came up with equally powerful arguments by suggesting that Clapham, Knepp and Kreter, when they argued about the continuity of the phenomenon, ignored the breaks that actually took place. So W. Rostow in 1960, when he wrote his Stages of Economic Growth, compared the two, the pre-modern and the modern industrial production, as like an aeroplane taxiing on runway and an aeroplane actually taking off. He spoke of a takeoff for industrial economy to bring about, to highlight the significance of the breaks that took place. That it's almost the difference between a plane taxiing on the ground and a plane really taking off flight. He argues that there was a real qualitative difference between the two stages in terms of the market that was addressed, in terms of the industrial technology that was deployed, and in terms of the significance that labor came to play. He argued that the market addressed by the modern industrial system was much larger, it was much more capital intensive, it was much more technology driven, and definitely it was much more labor displacing than what it used to be earlier. So the differential, Rostow would argue, was that the significance of the labor input in industrial production began to change dramatically in the 18th century, and no amount of emphasis on evolutionary transformation could take care of that argument. Towards the end of the 1970s, David Landis reinforced this argument further in favor of a revolutionary transformation by looking at the phenomenal changes that took place in technology in terms of industrial production. And he shows that the shift that took place from animate sources of energy to inanimate sources of energy in Britain in the 18th century cannot be explained by any amount of evolutionary explanation of the revolution. Because in terms of continuities, then charcoal should have continued to power the blast furnaces in all over Western Europe. There should have been no shift to coal. The shift from charcoal to coal, the shift from horse-drawn carriages to steam-powered railways, David Landis suggests, is case enough for a revolutionary transformation. Almost around the same time, E.J. Hobsbawm endorsed the argument in favor of a revolutionary transformation by highlighting on the phenomenal socio-economic changes that were brought about by this restructuring of European industry. There used to be a time when European industry was dominated by master craftsmen who would impart their skills to journeymen, who would then take in apprentices in order to educate them into the art of industrial production. That thing changes completely. The significance, the social significance of the artisan who could weave cloth well began to be replaced by a person who could run a machine better. Also, the artisan who used to cultivate the soil during agricultural seasons and would shift to proto-industrial activities in the non-agricultural season, that binary bifurcation of economic activity also changed, and people began to be now more full-time involved more full-time in industrial production. In the decade of the 1960s itself, however, the most serious challenge to the Rostonian theory of stages of economic growth come from Alexander Gerschenkron. Gerschenkron argued that by the very fact that Britain happened to industrialize in the second half of the 18th century, it could no longer, being the first industrial economy, it could no longer serve as a model for any other economy anywhere else in the world. Roster's argument was that all economies have to go through definite changes in terms of their economic organization in order to reach the industrial stage. Gerschenkron argued that the moment one economy has industrialized, everyone else has to follow suit, otherwise they would be just swept out of the market. So Gerschenkron began to argue that there was indeed a relentless course of industrial advancement in Europe between 16th and 18th centuries. But once Britain made the leap, once Britain reached the critical mass and then suddenly witnessed a dramatic transformation, no other society in Europe or elsewhere could afford to go through this natural trajectory of industrial advancement. In the 1980s, NFR Crafts mounted a far more substantive challenge to the argument about revolutionary change. Taking into account the total volume of industrial capital, technology and social overhead capital that comes into being around the Industrial Revolution, Crafts argued that Dean, Cole and later Hobsbawm had exaggerated the scale of economic growth in British economy, and that British economy in general and British industry in particular had grown at a far less dramatic scale than earlier believed. Crafts contended that the transformation of and growth of British industry was nowhere near as dramatic as it appeared to the contemporary people in Britain as well as Europe, that it was more by way of evolution that the industrial organization changed. To conclude, one needs to make this one final point, that the historians' approach to whether the transformation was revolutionary or evolutionary depends on which particular society, which particular economy he was looking at. American and British historians like Clapham, Neff, Dean, Hobsbawm, Landis, focusing primarily on the case study of the British industrialization and looking at the dramatic breakthrough, insisted that this was a revolutionary transformation. By contrast, people like Creeder and Gerschenkron, looking at the continental cases, were more concerned with the continuities that could be noticed in terms of industrial evolution over the 2 centuries that went before, and they insisted that the transformation was not quite revolutionary, it was much more general and as a part of a general trajectory that happened. So the break that did take place was not actually a revolutionary break, it was merely an acceleration. It was a break in terms of the scale rather than the quality of the change that mattered.